They probably don't need any introduction, but I'll do one shortly. Swan Signal Live is a production of Swan Bitcoin. It's the best way to accumulate Bitcoin with automatic recurring buys. And in honor of Robert Breedlove being a guest today, you can visit swanbitcoin.com/Breedlove to get $10 of Bitcoin dropped into your account after you start accumulating with Swan. Okay, so Tuur Demeester of Adamant Capital and has dropped some of the best Bitcoin writing on the scene in the past few years. And we paired him with Robert Breedlove, who's also done the same. His piece, Bitcoin and the Number Zero, one of the best in the past year for sure. Robert Breedlove is CEO and CSO of Parallax Digital. Welcome, Tuur. Welcome, Robert.
Thanks, Brady. Glad to be here.
Absolutely, man. All right, so let's just start with the macroeconomic climate. This is, starting most conversations here on Swan Signal when we have guests on who are, equipped to speak on this subject. It's, a topic that all Bitcoiners are interested in right now. Pretty much everyone in the world is being affected by the monetary policies of central banks and governments around the world. Are we in the midst of a currency collapse? What's going on? What do you guys think is going to play out in the next, months and years?
What are you talking about? It's just business as usual.
Unfortunately true.
Well, yeah, exactly. No, but I've been worried about inflation. I really think it's coming, and of course, it's one of these things. Like a lot of people have cried wolf about inflation, and starting in 2008, and some of them even before that. But I just think that we are seeing the writing on the wall now, and I'm expecting inflation in all the major currencies the next 2-3 years to really ramp up significantly. And, maybe the stock market is going to keep going up because who the hell wants to be in bonds these days? So I feel very good just focusing on, liquid assets with low third-party risk, which is bound to be Bitcoin and gold.
I echo that sentiment a lot, that hard money as a category is going to perform very well amid these, excessively expansionary monetary conditions. So gold and Bitcoin will do really well, but it does seem to me like we are actually in the end game now, so to speak. I think we've printed more money in the past 6 months than we have in the past 10 years almost. And when you understand this business model of central banking, that it is a leverage-based business, it requires steadily more leverage to remain sustainable. So you have to keep servicing prior debts. So you have to keep feeding the beast more and more. And this thing is full parabolic. I tweeted a photo the other day showing the U.S. M2 money supply. It's full on parabolic from 1980 to today. And against that, we have the flattening of the curve, so to speak, with the Bitcoin money supply. So I think we're going to see a lot of that value flow to scarce assets.
Yeah, and to me, it's scary because I was rereading. I think it's called. It's the little book by. Oh my God, I'm embarrassed now because
Jimmy Song and all the other guys.
Can you cut this? Let me look it up. But it's a little book about the events just prior to the French Revolution, and it's just eerie how many similarities there are, and also this idea that at the time but France is strong and credit worthy, and we've been doing this for 200 years. What are you talking about? We'll just every time there's a crisis, we'll just step up and just and initially, which was something new that I learned, is that the assignats, they were not just money backed by the lands of the church from day one. They actually started as government debt certificates. And then eventually, or pretty quickly actually, the government decided to declare those money. And that could be something to look out for if a central bank declares government bonds to be money. That could really just be okay, this is code red. Hyperinflation is literally around the corner now.
Yeah,
that's one of the challenges of central banks now, is that they can issue more debt, but that often their mandate does not allow them to directly print money. So that would be that like phase change that could really make things go bonkers.
That's correct. I think too, another thing to look out for, there is an amendment to the Federal Reserve Act where they can start actually directly monetizing to pay government expenditures. Right now, there's a bit of an interface there they have to go through, but that could quickly be removed.
And apparently this is already happening in the UK. So the UK could be a little bit of the canary in the coal mine, like if things start going weird there, because they are actually already directly doing that now.
That's right.
So for people out there who may not understand, I mean, we talk about, the central banks printing money, and that's what the shorthand that we use, since the effect essentially is the same. How do central banks, what mechanisms do central banks use to effectively print money now, since they don't have the mandate for the most part to directly print money, as you put it, Tuur?
Well, yeah, I mean, they lend money. So they lend money to the guys that spend it. So this just kind of, eventually it trickles down into the economy. But of course, the guys who spend it are, you bail out companies, you bail out governments. And so, and of course, Wall Street. And a lot of that money kind of goes into not necessarily to very base consumer goods. So that's the kind of the very sad, part of this story is that like once the inflation shows up in consumer goods, it's like the balloon everywhere else is already so blown up that it's about to burst. And so, but it's like there's no warning signals, like that we get all these asset bubbles, and then the last, I'm speculating, of course, but the last ones to be warned is going to be the blue collar workers and people who just live from paycheck to paycheck. All of a sudden, these costs are going to skyrocket. And that's, of course, when everybody knows, like, it's here.
Yeah, I think definitions are very important in this respect, because it's common for us to say that central banks are printing money, but what they are in fact doing is creating additional claims on productive assets, right? Still in the world today, gold is the only money. Gold is what is at the foundation of all central banking. And the claims that they've created on top of it, which were once redeemable for gold, and as we all know, they are no longer, they are just now essentially claims on productive assets that they're using to manipulate markets. And I do think that it's insidious almost in how illusory it is, because even if you look at Venezuela, they had the best performing stock market as they were going through hyperinflation, because the nominal returns in the stock market are denominated in a failing currency. And I think you're seeing that today. The writing is on the wall. We have 40 million plus unemployed, new all-time highs in the stock market. So I do think we are in the early stages of a currency collapse. And the other real trigger event that I'm looking for is that around 2022, the total U.S. government mandatory outlays will exceed tax revenue. So that's interest and mandatory outlays will exceed tax revenue. And from there, you have to print the interest, so to speak. And that's just totally unsustainable. Like they have to default either implicitly or explicitly.
Yeah, and a lot of people are saying like, oh, but what are you talking about? The inflation is only 2%, 3%. Like actually, if you look at cost of living, for example, in the US and in an average city, the past 5 years, it's gone up 10% every year. Just, like the CPI, like the government issued inflation rates, like guess what? They have an incentive to kind of underreport what's really going on. And they have a tendency to change their methodology over time. So it's important to also try and find some real numbers. There's a website called Shadow Stats where you can go that actually uses the government method to calculate inflation, except they go back to the 1980s method and they just, project that forward instead of, agreeing with the government and changing it all the time. And there as well, you can see it's actually already 10%.
That's right. They do that to inflation. I think unemployment as well. They literally show how the government has changed their calculation criteria for each of these core economic metrics over time. And it's always to their favor, right? Always trying to underreport unemployment or underreport inflation. So yeah, it is quite radical, the shift we're going through. And I think there's just a lot of historical inertia. Some people would call it Lindy effect for the dollar, that it's just been stable. It's been a reserve currency for 100 some odd years. Everyone's comfortable with it. And, it gets really to the roots of belief systems, frankly. And belief systems are here to preserve us. Like it shakes up people's identity. To talk about the U.S. dollar, depreciating at all, much less hyperinflating, I think it really gets to people's root nationalism, religious identity, all these things. So it's a scary time.
I agree. It goes really deep. And that's probably why, like, you and I both like look at religions and the history of, institutionalized religion to kind of find something that's potentially analogous, that's powerful enough as a comparison, rather than just another, kind of incremental step change in the evolution of technology or something.
Let's dive into the kind of the transitions as we were starting to get into it there. Throughout history, a transition of the reserve currency has always been marked by turmoil and uncertainty. One country's decline, the rise of another. Obviously, that's marking some radical changes in the world. The country that dominates the global currency in any given period is, usually marked with the status of the reserve currency. Spain and Portugal, 15th and 16th centuries, the Netherlands in the 17th century, France and Britain, and then finally the US. Tuur, let's start with you. What do you think we can learn from past reserve currency transitions, and how might a transition to a Bitcoin standard be different?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much we can learn. I think it's, of course, important to look at, but these changes in reserve currency status, I think they were not as meaningful as the potential change we're looking at now, because back then you could always call bluff. Like if you're receive some kind of certificate of debt or whatever, you could always like cash it in for real money, and oftentimes like the right to issue coin, it just meant like Great Britain was the dominant trade partner, and so obviously they kind of they had rules about who was able to issue coin. And yeah, of course there was some seigniorage, like you would clip off a little bit and re-smelt it, so that you could, in a way, say it was like a tax that you could levy, but that's just not comparable to where we are today. Like the kind of tax that the U.S. government can levy today is just way beyond anything a historical, empire in charge of the reserve currency could do. So yeah, but I guess for that reason, I haven't dived in that deeply in terms of like what changed that. It's just, I feel like it was a marketing bit as well to some extent, where like, the face of the Spanish king is like circulating around the world. It's like I was just thinking the other day, like these statues, like the amount of money that was invested in just putting up statues everywhere. I mean, those were the billboards of the back in the day. And in a way, I think that money had a kind of a function in that sense as well, to really advertise, like, look who's in charge here. Like we're able to get into your pocket, literally. So I think it was a propaganda tool as well.
Yeah, I like that analogy actually, because so gold and Bitcoin, we call them bearer instruments, but what they really are is self-sovereign assets, so that each market actor is determining what's best for him or her in any given moment. And they're contributing, I think, what is a little shard of their sovereignty towards whatever they decide is best. And that's what gave gold kind of its sovereignty in the free market. And what we've seen across history is just people taking advantage of that, right? Trying to step in, provide a certification function via coinage, and then abusing the trust placed in them. And now it's just been taken to the ultimate extreme, where we're not tethered to economic reality whatsoever. It's just this unbridled race to the bottom across all national currencies, where the game theory literally is print as much as you can, as fast as you can, without disturbing the peace, so to speak, keep the host alive, and acquire as many scarce assets as you can on the way to the bottom. And every nation is accusing every other nation of like currency manipulation. So it's just, the game is just, I listened to a session with Novogratz and Moorhead this morning, and Novogratz said the kids are at play in the candy shop. The adults are gone. Like, it's just, everyone's taking what they can get. And, when you come to see central banking as that's what the model is designed for. It's literally designed to reallocate claims on things from one group of people to another. So I guess it's hard to say what shape this change takes, but I think the biggest lesson for global reserve assets is that change is coming. Like it has continuously changed over time. The one thing that hasn't is gold, which makes Bitcoin so interesting because it is disruptive to gold across all properties of money, right? It's more divisible, durable, recognizable, portable, and scarce. And it also introduces this thing, securability, where it's so much easier to secure it. I think that's the real entry point to the rabbit hole there. Or another portal in the rabbit hole is that gold is being disrupted amid all this international currency crisis.
I mean, gold has been artificially undervalued for such a long time. There's even, some evidence that the introduction of the euro was actually a way to try and diminish the role of gold, because in a way you had the dollar versus gold, but what if you had like a new boxer in the ring that was more exciting and sexy, and then so that the idea would be that's the euro, and then you can have this kind of like shadow fight that everybody's distracted by, and then the real money is kind of faded into obscurity. There's a paper called The Demonetization of Gold by Alexandre Lamfalussy, written in the 60s, and he's considered to be one of the founding fathers of the euro. So it's just really interesting to kind of,
There's great parallels there too to the shadow fight with politics, right? This red and blue thing,
yeah,
they're all taking handouts from banks, right?
I don't know if that was the way you're getting at the two-party system.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it's just I think there's a lot of theatricality put before us to distract us from the truth, and the truth is gold is money. It has been centralized and controlled for a long time, and now there's a technology that's disruptive to gold, but very few people understand that today.
But what if governments manipulate the Bitcoin price? Then I'm always like, yeah, but how much Bitcoin do they have in their vaults to then put selling pressure on the market? Like they could only manipulate it by buying it, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, they have 20% of the gold supply. So assuming they would need at least 20% of the Bitcoin supply, that's a very bullish sign.
Yeah, it's like the negative price manipulation is like, you can safely say it's decades ahead.
Yeah.
So you guys both have dropped some fantastic Bitcoin writing lately, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to pair you up. You both have dived into history to draw analogies to help us understand what's happening here with Bitcoin. Tuur compared Bitcoin to the Reformation and Robert to the number zero. I know you both reread each other's pieces last night, and I'd love to hear you guys just discuss them. Robert, you want to start? Or Tuur, let's start with you. What did you think of Robert's piece? And let's hear any questions you might have for Robert.
Yeah, well, I think it was Cory maybe asking like, oh, what's your favorite piece you've read in the past year? Like I would say it's it's the number zero in Bitcoin, Robert. I really enjoyed it. What I like about it is just the kind of multidisciplinary approach where you're just trying to tie in a lot of things together. And I find, one of the most exciting ways to read history is like to read it through a certain prism. And then of course you can't just stick with that one prism. Like you want to look at it from multiple angles, but because it kind of like makes it clear what the underlying approaches, whereas like a lot of, if you read like some generic history, well, that there's criteria for filtering and selection, but you don't really know what they are. So there's this kind of faux neutrality to them. And so, yeah, that's why, the Nick Szabo stuff I also like, because it's usually also from a very specific angle. And there's like, you can read the history, you can read the world history of the past 100 years through the prism of crude oil, for example. And so I thought the number zero is just a fantastic way to do it. And of course, the way you tie it in with Bitcoin is what makes it so original. And I think it's spot on. I mean, I really, maybe except for, there's like a little line that's like, oh, well, Aristotle's edifice was shattered. And then I'm kind of triggered. Like, God damn it. He's still relevant.
He
Anyway,
is
but other than that, I
super
really
relevant.
enjoyed it.
Yeah, I do not, by no means, do I intend to discount Aristotle by any means. Thank you. Thank you very much. And the one point there was that I think it broke the power base of the church, right? The church was using Aristotle's story to substantiate their claim to sovereignty on earth. And the premise on that claim was that there was no infinity and no void. So zero sort of shattered that, so to speak. But yeah, still a big fan of Aristotle. And I agree that, looking at history through multiple prisms, I like the way you said that. It really does give it much more of a, that's what a free market is, right? We're looking at the world through a lot of different prisms. Everyone's individual perspectives and actions being compressed into a market price that we all orient ourselves against. And markets too, they generate prices, but also they're generating these innovations, which are like our best approximation of dealing with uncertainty effectively. It's like the best means we've come up with to satisfying this want. And I would argue too that, true entrepreneurs operating in the free market with skin in the game, that's where you develop competence and character as well. So I think it's really, that's where people become, virtuous, I guess. So I think I see free markets as generating those things like truthful price signals, real innovation, and virtuous characters. And, Tuur, your piece, I read it again last night, the Reformation. I loved the part about the Amsterdam Wisselbank and how it became sort of the ultimate safe haven for, I guess it was monetary metals, basically. People were stashing their gold and silver there. And then because of its geographic positioning, so it was like surrounded by water. I think it had a moat or creeks or something around it. So it was very difficult.
It was in downtown Amsterdam, like really smack downtown, which was, the heart of the one place that everybody had the most reason to want to protect.
Right. And Amsterdam at the time was, they had the reserve currency, right? Or maybe this is.
It's a matter of debate,
Yeah.
I would say gold and silver specie was more, was just the money.
But so they were, again, because of their access to water, they were becoming like a preeminent merchant civilization, basically, right? They were becoming very wealthy through trade. Mercantilism was disrupting kind of the older models that landlords and churches controlled, which you made the real good argument, which I thought was interesting, that because more trade, the world was trading more wealth was being created, such that land became less of an overall component of wealth, which actually took power away from landlords and churches, which I thought was really interesting. But at the Wisselbank, I came to see it as sort of this ancestor to Bitcoin in a way, in that it was a safe haven because it had, they had 4 bookkeepers and then 4 counter bookkeepers. So they had all these segregation of duties across the accounting functions. Everyone's checking each other's work. It's isolated by water, so it's in a place that's difficult to invade. They had very specific rotations as of duties. So it's kind of like this, wet code version of what Bitcoin has become dry code.
It's like a proto blockchain or something.
Like a proto blockchain, yeah. It was super interesting. Yeah, that's what stood out to me.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you liked it. And I think in general, like I in order to kind of produce reports or articles like that, you have to like go through a slog of material. And I've, one of the things I always enjoyed so much about Nick Szabo and actually a lot of the cypherpunk writers is that they're kind of like, kind of like the sophists or something and I mean it in the neutral or in the positive sense in ancient Greece, where they just really are market participants and they're not so much part of the establishment. They're not so much kind of entrenched in academia. Like, I mean, the other day I wanted to like read this book on Aristotle's Four Causes, and I looked it up and it was $120, and it was just, what? And I contacted the author and he said, like, yeah, the price is way too high. Here, let me send you the last draft, and I just got it for free. But so there's just so much stuff behind these paywalls, and there's just something about that I feel like is going to change. Like I think that there's too much intellectuals are stuck in kind of an ivory tower, and I think the internet really is the kind of the catalyst for changing that, because now it's so like, you know, we're talking here, like we don't need a publisher or an institution to back us up to make this possible. So I'm excited about that, I think that this is kind of really, the world is changing, and you know, knowledge is made more accessible, but also because the dialogue is so much more open, I think we'll see like leaps in terms of, you know, new paradigms that are breached open, or new ideas, or ideas that were valid and true and that were produced decades ago are gonna find new podia, and that's really exciting to me.
You know, you hit on a lot of things that I'm really big on. I really consider the digital age is so interesting because it really does feel like a time where the possibilities are endless, you know, not to sound cliche, but it's almost as if, again, if we're back to that free market perspective, where the more wealth is created, the more rapidly and we can share perspectives and iterate against one another. So another way to think about a market is it's basically just a forum for betting against one another. We're all just trying to prove each other wrong in the marketplace. And in that betting process, we naturally stumble upon things, discoveries, innovations, whatever, that actually benefit the world, right? And we have an incentive to sell them into the marketplace. So I think that the digital age introduces an entirely new, it just disrupts the forum. Like it's almost like this digital dissolving agent to anachronistic institutions that we used to need for trust and belief. And as you said, the ivory towers, and you see them in academia, you see them in you know, nation state political structures across the board. And I really see what I like to call the digital dissolving fluid, just sort of eroding those and shifting trust. The need to trust someone because they sit behind a bigger desk or wear a nicer suit, you can just trust the math, right? Or just trust the code. So it actually lowers these barriers to trade and interaction such that it enriches human potential to a way we've never seen or even contemplated. And I think, too, you know, as you said, more access to knowledge, like it is through accessibility, that's what leads to the collision and recombining of ideas, right? I think Matt Ridley, the author, talks about ideas having sex. Like they need to go into the marketplace, they meet, they recombine, new ideas spin off, some die, some live. Like it's a Darwinian natural selection of ideas, basically. That's what the global economy is intended to be. And that's why we trade, right? Because we all have different ideas and perspectives. So the accessibility to knowledge and the sharpening or specialization of knowledge are directly correlated. And we now have unprecedented access to knowledge, right? Such that it not only spatially, but also temporally. Like we can go deeper into history, and you know, we have the Library of Alexandria, so to speak, at our fingertips, in our pocket, in our smartphone. And it's radical and hard. It's hard to even get your head around how profound that is. And I've talked about this on your show, Brady, that as a result of all that, there seems to be a resurgence of ancient wisdom in the world. Like we've seen through markets and trade and interconnection, like some of the wisdom of the East, for instance, come to the West. Like we've had yoga, meditation, Ayurvedic medicine. Now you're seeing things like paleo diets, carnivore diets, like all these things that are getting us back to our roots of who we are. And in that context, I argue Bitcoin is essentially the same thing. We're rediscovering the Austrian economics of money. And Austrian economics are basically the compressed ancient wisdom, if you will, of economics. Whereas Keynesian economics is central bank propaganda we've used for the past 200 years. So which I'm reading this book right now, it's radical, that the torch was so dimly lit on Austrian economics that it was like down to just Mises at one point. Yeah. It was one guy in the world, basically, carrying the torch. And he went to the front lines of battle. He was deployed. So it's like, that's how close this thing was to never having Mises. And if you didn't have Mises, like what would Bitcoin have been? Like, who knows? But it was that fucking close. And by some miracle, it survived. And now we have Bitcoin turning Austrian versus Keynesian economics from a philosophical debate into a real live market test.
And yeah, and we really are seeing an Austrian revival. Like, it's, you know, when I first got involved with Austrian economics, it was like 2005, and yeah, it was better than the 80s. It was definitely, you know, but it was kind of like catching up with just the internet. But I feel like its market share in the digital space has now been increasing too. I guess Ron Paul was like a little spike of like interest for people, but I think, and it's a little bit sad that some of the original Austrian economics proponents took a long time to understand Bitcoin. They were like saying that it was, you know, violating some of the basic
the regression
theorems, things like that. And so that's a little bit sad. They really missed a significant opportunity. But I agree that you know, the internet is like the Library of Alexandria in our pocket, and I think that, to me, explains also why universities are eroding. And I don't think they'll disappear. I think there is value in the community aspect of a university, and you can network, and there's like a high concentration at the good universities, a high concentration of you know, very smart and capable people. And as an 18-year-old, you can all of a sudden get exposure to that. That's valuable. But I think a big reason why universities became so big and dominant as a system, it was because they were the gatekeepers of knowledge. Like, they had the libraries, and you had to go there. You had to somehow be affiliated to get access. And then later they tried to digitize that. And then you have Elsevier and these other publishers with these crazy paywalls. But that's just blown to smithereens now. It's just, you know, incredible how accessible knowledge is. I mean, I thought I was lucky that when I was a student, I could like access Google Books and at least like read some snippets, and, you know, but now it's just, I mean, it's incredible. And it's like, there's this Dutch author, I forget his name, but he has this metaphor of the golden wall, where like, I think his book is called The Discovery of Heaven. The idea of a golden wall where like, we're all on one side of that wall as like the plebs, the plebeians, and then behind the wall is where the experts are doing their thing, like where the politicians are making the laws, or like where, you know, I guess the epidemiologists are figuring out, like, you know, what is going to happen with this pandemic. But then there are sometimes moments in history where you get to really peer over that wall and stand on top of it and realize, like, this is all pretty messy, and these people are like, they're not like some other race. They're not angels. They're just fallible, and often they don't know what they're doing. And so we can kind of get over this restraint of but I'm not allowed to talk or speak up because I'm not an expert. Like, I don't have my PhD, and so I should shut up. I love that, you know, in Twitter, like, or whatever, the internet, anybody is allowed to speak up, and we're getting more and more into this era of meritocracy, where you can just, you know, just pave your own way, and the quality of your work is going to prove itself. Like, you don't, which obviously is, you know, one of my pet peeves, because I dropped out of university. So I did have that, you know, fear for a while of like, oh, like, am I even allowed to speak up or speak my mind or speak with any kind of anything resembling authority on something? So anyway, just to like, I agree that this library in our back pocket is very, very powerful.
I think what you're saying is very important as well, that, you know, universities will always serve a purpose. Like, we're meant to, it's when people leave childhood and go into adulthood so that they can assemble in these new groups and become equipped with, you know, knowledge of history and philosophy and all these really important things that here is basically the heritage of who you are as a human. Now go and take on the world, right? That's always going to be an important system. But like with so many other things, I think the fiat system has corrupted it, right? I remember being in college, the number one expense, next second to tuition, was the cost of books. I would go and buy 6 to 10 books per semester for $3,000 to $4,000, which is just, it's asinine, right? It's monopolistic. And then you factor in like the student loan, the student debt piece, right? That we've saddled all of our best and brightest coming fresh into the world with, I don't know what the number is now, $2 or $3 trillion in student loan debt, right? Is that clearly that's a poor idea to the people that you're investing with the future of your world to straight out of college give them, $50, $100, $200,000 student loan obligations. That dramatically reduces their potential, right? Just out of the gate. So it's a true fiat problem. And
Yeah.
I think you're just seeing, to your point, the monopolies are being eroded by digital tech, right? And the gatekeepers, if you've got a gatekeeping or intermediate business model today, I'd be worried. Like, I think all of your gates that can be eaten by software will be eaten by software because the cost collapses 10,000x. This isn't like, oh, someone's going to come out and compete you. It's like it's like an extinction level event for your business model. And you're seeing that in banking. You're going to see that, in academia. I don't know what form it's going to take, but it's going to decentralize and bring the costs down a lot. And so through that lens, I love that you dropped out of university. Like, I graduated, but it doesn't matter. Like, I paid for it. I learned I learned some things, but I've learned 99 times more as a self-taught person. And I think in that lens and the digital renaissance, whatever you want to call it, like the autodidacts are the neo-renaissance men. Like, if you have a hunger to learn, you can satisfy it.
Yeah, when I learned about the history of the university, and this is a while ago, but it really blew my mind because like the original in the high Middle Ages, like it was not the university. It was called Universitas Scholarium et Magistrorum. So it was like the community of students and teachers, and they were student led. Like, they were the student body who was paying the teacher and who was basically telling them, and they would have every year they would have a meeting without the teacher being present where they would discuss what wage he was going to get. And there's examples of teachers not being allowed to leave the city because they had to, finish the term for the students. And it is just this kind of incredible reality where the students were really in charge of these universities, and where you could just enter, in a way, a university. I think Abelard did that. And you start debating with the teacher. And if the student body thinks that you're actually better, they can just switch and they can join you, and all of a sudden you have a university, which is pretty much what's happening with podcasts nowadays. And I think that's if you will, the model that I think should inspire us to kind of keep the torch alive of, higher education.
I love that. I'd never heard of that, but being able to fork your college, that's super cool.
Well, I mean, Aristotle did that. I mean, he left Plato's university and he started his own Lyceum.
That's right.
Yeah.
I love this conversation, guys. First of all, I love this format. I love bringing two, knowledgeable, thoughtful Bitcoiners together to give a forum for these discussions. This is exactly what we're looking for. So this is awesome. I love the idea of the internet freeing information, freeing money, freeing individuals, empowering, people who are interested in learning on their own to dig and research and synthesize thoughts and really come up with new ideas. It's an amazing time to be alive. One thing that I am curious about and like to talk about right now is ideas about the future of the way we govern our society in a Bitcoin world, with all of this change that we're seeing, kind of fundamental change to society in general, the underlying bedrocks of society. The Reformation itself was marked by the questioning of long-term institutions of the church. I would argue that this led to the separation of church and state, the fight for that in the United States and the Constitution. How do you guys think that the separation of money and state would affect the way we govern society? Would it be a drastic change, the end of the nation state, or are we talking more like smaller changes to kind of the system that we have now? Robert, you want to take this one first?
Sure, that's a small question to tackle. I would just like to say, for starters, there is no playbook for this. Right? We are, as such, when there was the separation of church and state, there was no playbook for that up until then. Right? No one could have foreseen modernity as we now experience it. So I guess that's a disclaimer, do your own homework, do your own research. But I do like to point people on this topic to the book that we've all probably read, and I've mentioned it 1,000 times, but The Sovereign Individual, written in 1997, dual authored, basically predicted the rise of social media. So they predicted a shift from broadcasting. Tuur's got the book right there. A shift from broadcasting to narrowcasting, which we would say is social media today. They predicted anonymous digital cash being disruptive to the nation state model. And they compared digital space to essentially being like the high seas, and that it's the one territory that no jurisdiction can project dominion over. Like the costs are too high to control the high seas. And they said digital space would be like that. It also predicted, which we haven't seen as much yet, but the digitization of all property rights and securities, and as we understand it today. So I think Bitcoin really is the biggest piece to all of that, but you will see distributed, cryptographically empowered software eat all the functions of government over time. Everything that it can eat, it will eat. Now, what shape does all this take? I think the main takeaway is that government would become a lot smaller and a lot more boutique, because as we know, as human beings, one size does not fit all, right? And if a government no longer has a monopoly on money such that it can enrich itself via inflation and taxation, then it can't necessarily impose its cultural model onto people. So people can fork off a lot more, like we were just talking about. People will be much more free to fork society, I think would be the big takeaway of it. And again, it gets strange here because people are like, what do you mean? I'm American. Like, some people have American exceptionalism, which I think is total bullshit, by the way. If you have that, you really need to check yourself. But I understand national pride. Like there's history there. We should identify with that. But I think the closer you look at it, there's this, I forget the name of the poet, but he said the oldest lie is that it is glorious to die for your country. And I really think that the closer you look at nationalism, that it's just kind of, maybe it was a useful fiction at one point, but it might be a lot less relevant going forward. Like, especially now that we've got a much larger perspective on who we are, where we are in the universe. We're all in one little tiny pale blue dot, as has been called, and clearly we've mismanaged the resources. It's a complex system such that our decisions impact everyone else. Chaos theory, you've got a butterfly flapping its wings, it calls a hurricane here. Like, we're all super interconnected. And I think that is really coming to the fore in consciousness. And now you're seeing people, we have protests in the streets in the US. All these things are being questioned. Everything is being put to the test of scrutiny now. And I think what that does is it just washes out all the bullshit and you're left with things of substance. So yeah, I think not to get too carried away, but in general, you see the monopoly of government becomes a more private function. It has to service its customers and it has to do so, has to satisfy them at market rates. And that, I think that takes you from a world of 200 countries to 20,000 or more in the long run.
Great. I don't know. No, but yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that. And also with just the caveat, like, all we know is change is coming. We don't, it's kind of that's kind of the thing with the market is like, the definition of it is that it's unpredictable and it's going to reflect people's desires. Like in some ways, dictatorships are a bit more, predictable. But yeah, in terms of, it's a bit of maybe a nuance or something, a small difference, but I don't talk so much about Bitcoin being a separation of money and state. I feel like it's more like the freedom of monetary freedom, basically. So similar to religious freedom, where you could just, believe whatever you want. So in a way, it diminishes the importance of going for the monopoly option. And so to me, I looked a lot at like the early days of New York City as kind of like the citadel. Like that was just incredible. And it was Flemings and Dutch guys who went out there. And what was different about that place from other colonies was that it was totally not religiously inspired. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to build paradise on earth here. It was just a trading post, and they were super pragmatic. And in the beginning, they were kind of like, I don't know if we want to allow Jews, like, or and these Muslims, and they were actually trying to stop that, but then they had to correspond with the home base back in Amsterdam, the VOC home base, corporate headquarters basically, and ask like, hey, tell us what to do. And I think the Jews even petitioned back to Amsterdam, and the word came back like, sorry guys, this is about markets and profit maximization, and we're just not going to have this discrimination anymore. It's not good for business. So maybe that's kind of a sidestep, but so I think that places like that is where the new world is going to flourish, and it's hard to predict where that's going to be. Like, likely it's going to be with a fairly high concentration of people that understand this new paradigm, that are kind of tech oriented, that have belief in the rule of law, and I think some old centers are going to weaken. And I think we will see, I mean, we have already seen peak government. I think that either it's now or it's like a few years ago, in terms of the percentage of GDP that the government can control without devolving into pure communism. I think we've seen that, but I think in terms of like practical takeaways, you probably want to stay flexible. If you're young, especially, like, don't maybe avoid investing too much in one particular spot, because that's going to become less relevant where you live, and countries are going to accommodate to that. They're going to know that in a matter of a few years they can have so many thousands of nomad workers who love this tax regime that's super friendly, and maybe we will see kind of a revival of city states, where this big empire, I mean, maybe it is fiat money that's the glue keeping all these empires together. And what if that goes away? Like, we're all like, defund the police. Like, people are looking into like, what is a city? And then they're like, oh, 80% of any city's budget is like the police force. So basically, the city is the police force. Like, I'm not saying that it should be one way or another, but like all these discussions about, I love the word unbundling. I think it's Fred Wilson, the VC, that they came up with that, or at least I heard it there first. This idea that, big conglomerations and monopolies, they bundle together a lot of services. And sometimes, because the technology has not advanced, you kind of have to do it that way. Like the old newspapers, they used to bundle a lot of services together, or like the telecom companies. But now, because of technology, we can totally unbundle that. And I think we're going to see that with governments. Like, their service package is going to be questioned and slowly unbundled. But I do think some are going to behave like Spain, that are just feeling entitled and resentful, and they don't care that it's very economically expensive to wage war and crack down and fund the Inquisition. And it'll be bad to be there. It won't be fun to live in those places. It could, China could be one of those countries, and maybe Hong Kong is the new Antwerp that got sacked, and that was this amazing trade hub for a couple decades and then kind of faded. And within the US, it remains to be seen. It's possible that it's going to split up, like that we'll see a breaking up of the empire, and that kind of maybe it'll be West and East. Who knows?
Yeah. I love what you brought up. On the succession piece, I think Texas has a clause in their constitution, right, that they can succeed as their own nation.
I have to look into that, but I mean, they definitely are in a good position because they have their own electricity grid, they're energy independent, and several other reasons.
Yeah, so I think it's a real possibility. I don't know the time frame at all clearly, but
look at the history of Russia, right? It fell apart.
Exactly.
Once the ruble fell apart, then the Baltic republics were like, why do we need Moscow anymore?
That's right. I love that you referred to New York, which actually, my favorite movie is Gangs of New York. And I think it's just a great, like, beautiful cinematic masterpiece of everything we're talking about, where, I mean, it's very zeroed in on New York clearly, but it was this fork. This America was basically this merchant-driven fork off of monarchical England, right? We had this monarchical structure that couldn't cast its dominion across the Atlantic Ocean, basically. And Americans just gradually realized that they're independent, and eventually that culminated in a war for their independence. And so again, you see there that this oceanic wall, where it's hard to project your dominion across that space, that's, again, you're back to that sovereign individual analogy to cyberspace. Like, it's very hard to cast a dominion across cyberspace because the walls are they're impenetrable, basically, right? You can put, assuming, that's what Bitcoin is you're basically preserving capital behind a mathematical wall that no one can really penetrate. So there's going to be a lot of demand for that. And so I think that this Bitcoin's emergence, it really does speak to the founding principles of America. Like, I think America as a state has really gone awry, but America as an idea is something really worth fighting for and preserving and defending. And, we're founded on capitalism, basically, right? It's individual sovereignty, that the individual, the sovereignty of the individual actually supersedes the sovereignty of the state. And that was a big deal, right? Because throughout history, it was not that way. It was top down, right? It was from the Egyptian ruler, where the pharaoh is God, everyone else is a peon, to monarchies, to aristocracies. And that was a big phase shift to put the individual on top of the state effectively. So that idea that America represents is really something worth fighting and preserving. And capitalism, like, just to drill down into what that is, it's very common. People think that we have a free market capitalist society, but it's just not true, right? Because, as we know, money is 1/2 of every transaction, and our money is not a capitalist structure. Capitalism, for me, basically means the exclusive right to the fruits of your labor. So whatever you spend your time producing, cultivating, making, whatever value you create, you have rights to that, to be able to trade it with others that have done the same. So other people spend their time working and producing. Everyone gets to trade the fruits of their labor. The net outcome of that is an increase in wealth and prosperity for all. That system of wealth creation has been hijacked by central banking, effectively. And
but Robert, somebody had to build the roads. You don't get it.
Yeah, right. Central banking is literally the 5th dictate in Marx's manifesto.
Yeah.
It is monetary socialism, is what I call it. I guess you could call it communism, authoritarianism, whatever. I distinguish capitalism as you get to own your own time. You decide how you spend your time and what to do with it. Time is money, right? Socialism is the state gets to decide. They have a greater or lesser extent in deciding how you spend your time and money. And as we see today, our monetary structure is fully socialist. Anyone that wants to deactivate your bank account, deauthorize your bills, reverse your transactions, they have that authority to do so. And so I think Bitcoin is just, we have true American monetary capitalism coming back into the world. And I think that idea is really, really worth fighting for.
It's like, under monetary socialism, the government defunds you.
That's right.
All right, this is a good time to bring in Cory Klippstein, founder of Swan. Cory, welcome to the discussion. Take the floor, man.
Yeah, this has just been spectacular to listen to you guys. Really appreciate it. As we were saying before the show started, really nice to talk to you again, Tuur, after meeting you, I think, one time a year ago at Bitcoin 2019.
At the very last conference I ever went to.
Yeah, it's been a while. Look forward to CK and Dave and the crew getting the next one set up so we can all go hang out again sometime soon, hopefully. And Rob, you and I obviously hang every once in a while here in LA, but I was sad to have a scheduling conflict when you and I were supposed to discuss and argue about Nassim Taleb in Bitcoin on Brady's show. So I'm glad to actually be able to bring that in a little bit here, because I was listening to the last section of the conversation. And one of the things that kind of strikes me, and this also ties in the work of like Peter Zeihan and Stratfor and kind of what's happened in the world order since World War II. You know, in a lot of ways, the American order, or Pax Americana, that's been created since World War II, and then, you know, layering on the demonetization of gold and, you know, 1971 and sort of fiat banking, which is coming to its absurd apex with the Robin Hood rally right now as the economy goes in the shitter. It really just got me kind of thinking about Taleb and basically how fragile this is and how we've been sort of like papering over all of the volatility that should be there in the system, but is not. And this goes for all of these countries that exist only because of, you know, free passage of ocean shipping that's provided by the American Navy, let's say, or, you know, just like IMF bailouts of countries that otherwise wouldn't exist anymore. They would have gone away a long, long time ago and would have been partitioned by neighbors or had been split up and, you know, balkanized by different groups within those hilarious borders. So this is not a natural state of things to have the borders as fixed as they've been for the last 80 years. So that was kind of the jumping off point. Wanted to get your reactions on some of those thoughts.
Tuur, you want to
Or I
start?
could just drop the mic.
Another resounding question. Thank you, Cory. I will chime in on part of it, at least. A couple of the authors you referred to, I actually haven't read yet. Is that The Fourth Turning? Is it?
No, but that was going to be the next topic I bring up. So you can save that one. No, so Peter Zeihan just came out with Disunited Nations, but he was also kind of like the main analyst for Stratfor down in Austin in like the 2000s and early 2010s.
They were in Austin. I didn't know that.
Yeah, Stratfor's in Austin. So George Friedman authored The Next Decade and the Next 100 Years. And
I read The Next 100 Years.
Yeah, so Peter's work is sort of reflected in those books, and then he's gone independent the last few years and been on the speaking circuit and finally came out with a book.
The book that concludes with Mexico being the next world superpower. That's 100 years.
Yeah. That's a little bit dated and things have gone a little bit sideways, but
it's gone side. I think he missed Bitcoin largely.
He's still missing Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But we'll get him eventually.
Yeah. So I think
everybody will.
A big theme there that I like to touch on, and this is Talebian, is that our human attempts to intervene with complex systems typically backfire, right? Like we really need to learn to work with them, not try to manage them. And in Talebian speak, he says that when we introduce human interventionism, we move from mediocristan to extremistan. And what these are two probabilistic domains, where in mediocristan is something much more organic, like your body weight, right? You can't double your body weight overnight. Like you probably can't even double it in a year. But when you're dealing with abstract functions, like your net worth, for instance, you can make or lose that in an instant, right? One trade. So I think Taleb's point is that in our attempts to manage complex systems, we've created these abstractions around them to try to represent them as if they're reality. And we move from this domain where things are more organic and adaptive and occur naturally to this domain that hides a lot of that natural volatility for long periods of time. And then finally, as it's diverged sufficiently from reality, it snaps in these cataclysmic collapses. And I think that's what central banking is, right? It's designed to mute price volatility. It's designed to mute unemployment volatility. It's designed to manage business cycles, which is, as we all know, total bullshit. And in that attempt by humans to intervene with a complex system that is the economy, we're just creating and exacerbating these cataclysms that we're seeing today. So yeah, I think that's my general feedback on that.
So I love that, because I think it also actually dovetails with, long-term credit cycles and, the four turnings and sort of this 80-year thing where we have, the War of the Spanish Succession and kind of destroyed Europe 1700, and then the revolutions of 1780-ish, and then the Civil War of 1860, and then World War II, 1940. And it's like, okay, here we are 80 years later, everything's absurd in the economy and in governments around the world. It's just this ridiculous thing that's going on, and we're going to kick off this new whatever it is. And the grand hope and what I think Bitcoin maybe represents, I've been kind of tweeting every now and again about like the fifth turning, and that maybe we don't need to go through these things anymore, that's not a natural state of affairs to keep on blowing everything up every 80 years. Because if you can go back and allow for localism and, you know, a natural level of organic volatility in some of these things, then you don't build so much fragility into the system by trying to smooth it out so much. So Bitcoin is kind of like an escape valve that gets us off of this stupid every 80 years, destroy everything and start anew with, you know, 50 to a few hundred million people dying. And maybe we can just be better as humans going forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that death cycles will probably always exist, but the extremes that we've seen in the past 100 years are just not natural. And I actually wrote a paper that closely relates to that in 2010, 2011. Basically, I was trying to, you know, find a definition for the business cycle. And weirdly, like if you look throughout literature, it's just not really there. There's not really a definition for what the business cycle is. I think Guido Hülsmann came really close when he called it an error cycle. It's like a period of time when people are accumulating a lot of errors, which is the suppressed volatility Robert was talking about. And then all of a sudden it becomes clear to the market that this whole edifice was built tilted and needs to be restructured. And so then you get the crash and everything comes down. But it doesn't make sense unless you differentiate just the natural occurrence that the market is, you know, sometimes gets it wrong for a while. You can't differentiate that from the business cycle. Like people intuit that there's a difference there, that it's not just like, oh, you know, people happen to be wrong. And the Austrians correctly point out, like there's this credit expansion. But so to me, it's a fraud cycle. Like it's a fraud cycle that is caused by institutionalized fraud in the financial realm. Like that's the definition I came up with, and I still think it's true and valid. And so Cory, to your point, like that I think that it's possible to get rid of this. Like it's not just some kind of, you know, storm that comes around every couple decades. We can get rid of this. And we have examples like 19th century America was just incredible in terms of, you know, and it was a deflationary economy, but it just kept growing and growing. And there were a few crises, but nothing of the size of a currency crisis or of 2008 or anything like that. They're just isolated events. They didn't lead to mass unemployment and things like that. Like, I mean, even look back at the Spanish, the Spanish flu in 1918. You know, it didn't lead to mass unemployment. The reason why we do have mass unemployment now is that it was like a hollowed out tree. The economy was like a hollowed out tree, and it just needed a little gust of wind to start, collapsing. And so it kind of frustrates me that we have the pandemic, because it's like, it's the best excuse for any politician. Like all this hardship is caused by the pandemic, and we can then discuss and talk about what we did wrong. And so it's kind of like a sideshow, but the main event is just the financial corrosion. And so I don't know, in terms of, you know, where are we going in the long run? To me, I'm suspending some of that, because I think in the short run, we're going to have inflation, and it's rough. Like that stuff is rough. And I think it's important to kind of, for everyone, and people are free to do what they want, but in terms of like thinking about how am I going to deal with this in the next 5 years once inflation comes around, and I think the effects are going to ripple across all strata. Like it doesn't matter if you're rich or not, you're going to feel it. If you're rich, you might be targeted, right? If you're poor, you lose your job, and you might have to figure out like, your diploma might become worthless. So I just think that it's important to think beyond like, oh, but I have, you know, some Bitcoin, you know, like the structure of society is going to change, I think, in the next couple of years.
I agree completely. I just want to add a couple things to that. I love, you know, that's dictator's playbook, right? Never let a good crisis go to waste. And man, are they playing that to a T? Like all they needed was that gust of wind, as you call it. Now they're engaging all the measures that they wanted to, basically. And it's true that inflation is much more insidious than just a loss of purchasing power. And you're not just protected from it by being in an inflation hedged asset, because what happens is that it reduces, I like to say it dilutes the trust fabric, basically. So people are less willing to enter into trustful business relationships because the future is more uncertain, right? So people become more protectionist, more nationalist, more defensive, I guess, in general. And that has an impact on trade. And trade is what generates wealth. So like you can't really protect yourself from it. Even if you're fully, perfectly inflation hedged, maybe your assets are going to do okay on a net value basis. But if trade is impeded and reduced in the world, then the world becomes less wealthy. Everything loses value. So I think that's really interesting. And then to go really deep, because I know we're here to do that. Bitcoin is such a fascinating invention because it kind of bridges physical and digital reality in a sense. And so in physical reality, we had, the mediocre stand, as Taleb calls it, like your body weight, right? It fluctuates kind of slowly and somewhat naturally. Whereas an extremist stand, which we'd call something in digital space, is more like your net worth. They can go 100x or zero in an instant, basically. But Bitcoin, by connecting digital space and anchoring it into the thermodynamic reality, right, the energy of the universe, it's preserved the advantages of like a physical like money, right? So we have physical like scarcity is actually even better than that. It's absolute scarcity. We have the settlement assurances of something like physical gold. We have the privacy of something like a private transaction. But you get all the digital like benefits as well in terms of portability, money supply, auditability, and transparency. So like we've never had an invention that bridges mediocristan and extremistan, or physical reality and digital reality, like we do with Bitcoin. And that's why I think we're all, the 10 guys, the 10 blind guys touching the elephant, they all describe it differently. Everyone's like, oh, one guy's touching the trunk, and it's like a long rope, and the other guy's touching the leg, and it's like a big tree stump, but they're all describing the same thing. It's like, it's hard for us to get our heads around how big of a deal this is, because we've never seen anything like it.
I agree. By the way, something I forgot to mention is a little book by a Brazilian entrepreneur called Ricardo Semler, and the title is Maverick. And I would definitely recommend it for anyone who's like, in the entrepreneurial, space, and because he's basically describing how he survived and thrived throughout the 80s as an entrepreneur in hyperinflationary Brazil. It's a really cool little book.
Nice. Okay, so let's wrap up with some price talk. It's being demanded in the chat room. We have about 5 minutes left here. So let's maybe follow up Tuur on Bitcoin and heavy accumulation, the report you published for Adamant Capital last April, talking about accumulating in the $3,500 range for the rest of that year or so. And then, in the abstract, it talked about how, a new bull market will permanently cement Bitcoin as a multi-trillion-dollar asset class. What's your latest take on near future Bitcoin price action?
Yeah, so I think the bottom is in. We had the puke phase and we had a 50% crash since, but we managed to kind of stay above. That was just so brief, and it was just caused by this crazy global liquidity event. So to me, I still see us being trading in this range of 10,500 all the way down to 6,500. That to me is the reaccumulation band, and it's kind of like the early stage of the bull market. It's where a lot of the weak hands are still selling, and institutions, family offices are accumulating. I think actually today, Fidelity came out with this report. They did a survey among large institutions, and over 30% of them now own Bitcoin. And so I think that's the big money. Those are the early movers. And right now, retail is still distracted by stocks. I think it's going to turn out to be a bad idea, because it's just, some of these companies are actually going to go bankrupt. And so you're going to have zero. It's better than bonds still, but it's still, very volatile and difficult to navigate. So I think a lot of that money is going to go back to Bitcoin. I think the reason why retail has not piled back into Bitcoin is that there's just this hangover. Like there was this massive outpouring of greed in 2017, and now everybody who got caught on the wrong side of that is still a bit embarrassed. Your family dinner, like, oh, you're still into that crypto stuff. Like, so I think some of that has to dissipate still, and eventually, I think 10,000 is one of these major psychological price points. It just takes some time to punch through it, and once we do, we're not going to go back. I think that's why we've been hovering above it and around it. But yeah, I mean, I think we're in a bull market. Like this is not going to die down. I think Bitcoin dominance is going to increase still. I think there is going to be other assets together with Bitcoin that are going to go up, but it might really not be altcoins. It might be, a lot of the music is playing in the derivative space now. So maybe it'll be over there. Maybe it'll be in, when some of these Bitcoin companies start going public, and that'll be like the equivalent of like the gold mining boom of the 1930s. So something is going to rally alongside Bitcoin that's going to give you alpha, but I think it's a little too early to really know what it is. But usually a good rule of thumb is that the previous cycle just does not repeat one-on-one. It won't.
I think that's great perspective, and in general, it's a lot of value will flow to anything that cannot have its quantity eased, right? And anything that's trustless. So again, gold, Bitcoin do well there. Zeroing in on Bitcoin a bit, I do think that at this point, it's safe to say that its next milestone is gold, right? It is, I think the narrative is pretty firmly established. It is being invested in that way as a hedge against central banking or expansionary monetary policy, and it's being evaluated based on its monetary properties, which is what made gold gold, right? So I do think that, and let's call gold a $10 trillion market, but it's also highly suppressed, as Tuur mentioned earlier. Like central banks own 20% of the supply. They have a number of schemes that they use, the London Gold Pool, et cetera, to actively suppress that price to defend their currencies from direct competition. So who knows what that real number is, but say it's 10 trillion. That's, I think, the next milestone for Bitcoin. I don't know that it will be in this cycle. Like I still expect Bitcoin to continue to move to these price cycles of kind of having boom, excessive FOMO bust. But I think by the, call it the 2028 to 2030 peak, it should be there. It should be at or beyond gold. And from there, I would say argue maybe even before there, kind of in that 4 trillion market cap range, we start talking about the Tulevian minority rule, where it starts to impose its rule set on the majority, basically, because, as we know, the rules of Bitcoin are totally obstinate, totally intolerant. And whatever that magic number is, call it 4% of global market cap of money, around 100 trillion. So if it's $4 trillion, I think they start to accelerate in a really interesting way. And you might see prior patterns become less relevant. And the other thing I think is that, to me, the value proposition, although you have to dig very deep, and you have to approach Bitcoin from first principles to understand it. Like you have to understand what made gold money, that it was the most divisible, durable, recognizable, portable, and scarce technology in the world. That's why people chose gold as money. And when you see that Bitcoin is superior across all 5 monetary properties, I think smart money is going to land on that. Like I can spit out that whole value prop in 30 seconds. I don't think smart money is going to let this thing get away from them. So when Bitcoin breaks $100,000, whatever the psychological threshold is, that it really reaffirms itself, that it's here to stay, it's not going away, and people are paid to figure out what the fuck it is and where it's going, they're going to start evaluating our work. And I think if you dig deep enough, you land on that bedrock, that from a first principle standpoint, Bitcoin is the best monetary technology we've ever had, and it is potentially disruptive to gold. And when that realization starts to dawn on people and smart money, like, I don't know, it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah, it's like, what if you could buy an equity stake literally in the internet, and we're like, early 90s, and the internet is just this one thing, one
Yeah.
protocol, and you can just get a piece of that, internet island, get some real estate there. What would you project the value of it as? Like, it just boggles the mind.
There's an old, I think it's a Jewish axiom where it talks about wealth allocation, and it basically says you should have a third of your wealth in cash, a third of your wealth in your business, a third of your wealth in land. And if you look at Bitcoin in that respect, that it really could become cash. Like, that could become our definition of cash. And that could be it for all time. Like, it's a call option on the productivity for the rest of history. I mean, that's a really big deal. It's a $100 trillion market-ish today. Who knows what it is going down the road. And when you combine that with governments that are going to become increasingly overreaching, and Bitcoin is this one property right that's, I call it imprescriptible, which means it cannot be taken away prescriptively. Like, it's the one asset you can own, one property right you can have that no government can take away from you. I think the demand is just going to surge. So I don't know what that time frame is. I don't know how long it takes people to realize it. I've tended to be more bullish in the past, but I think it will happen. The free market finds truth.
One thing that I would also suggest, and it's kind of in line with Rob's points, is to the audience, is to try and start looking at markets denominated in gold, really. Just look at stock markets denominated in gold, bonds, real estate, and that'll kind of demystify some of the narratives that we're seeing in the media, like, oh, the stock market rebounded all the way. No, it didn't. If you look at, denominated in gold, it did not reach the previous highs, and it's gonna keep. I think it'll allow you to just have a more of a sober look, because denominated in dollars, everything is going to go through the roof, and it just doesn't mean anything if your cost of living is also going through the roof, expressed in dollars.
I agree 100%.
And then, of course, you want to say, like, yeah, but why not express it in Bitcoin? It's just because you can go back 40 years and express it in gold. Like, there's just way more, and you don't have that startup aspect anymore. Like, gold is a $5 or $10 trillion market, so I think it's kind of good to use it as the gold glasses, like, put them on and look at the world through them.
And it's good bait down the rabbit hole, because then you're like, well, what made gold valuable? And then when you figure that out, you figure out why Bitcoin's valuable.
But, like, I mean, in terms of, like, keeping assets safe, like, if you trust the Bitcoin mining, that's decentralized enough, it just, how exciting is it for any family office? They used to, like, park their money in the US because it's safe there, but now because of all these anti-money laundering laws, that information is leaking, and so they're basically, like, so vulnerable. Some of these second world entrepreneurs and family offices, like, and the idea that you can just have a multi-sig wallet and you store one key per continent, like, that's just the definition of robustness. I think that is going to excite a lot of people as we move into first capital flight, people trying to get their money out, then capital controls. That is going to make all this boring stuff of, like, oh, Bitcoin doesn't have any innovation. It's not true. The innovation is happening where it matters, which is wealth preservation and secure management of keys, which is very hard. That is going to start shining, I think.
I agree, and I think another thing to dovetail on that, for family offices, a lot of them that I've spoken to in the past, they do collateralized lending type arrangements. And Bitcoin, another thing, we didn't touch on it today, but it's super collateral, right? It's encumbered, it's a bearer asset, so just by holding it, it's unencumbered. It's 24/7 liquid. There's no title search. There's no legal anything. And then you couple that with, you mentioned Texas earlier, with all this excess energy production. It's like any jurisdiction that's in that situation can now monetize that energy directly and anonymously. So there's going to be this huge demand as people wake up to government overreach. I think you'll see people entering Bitcoin mining markets and then using it as collateral to fund myriad other business models.
All right, guys, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for the incredible conversation. I just want to repeat that, I'm really loving this format, providing a forum to pair of Bitcoiners for discussions you're not going to find anywhere else. So subscribe to the podcast at swansignalpodcast.com. We're on YouTube, youtube.com/swansignal. Swan Signal Live is a production of Swan Bitcoin. It's the best place to accumulate Bitcoin, the easiest place. You just auto fund your USD. We auto buy BTC for you. You can set up auto withdrawals of your BTC to your own wallet. Check out swanbitcoin.com/breedlove for $10 of BTC dropped into your account after you start saving with Swan. All right, we'll see you all next week. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Brady. Thanks, Tuur.